The rain poured over the brick streets of Boston, washing against the tall windows of the Jenkins family home. Nora sat quietly in her father's study, watching the water track down the glass while her father paced the floor. Silas Jenkins was a man broken by his own bad choices, his hands shaking as he held a stack of unpaid bills. He explained the situation clearly, leaving no room for hope or negotiation. The family empire was completely gone, swallowed by bad investments and debts that could no longer be hidden from the public. Their only choice to avoid total poverty and social exile was a marriage alliance with the most powerful family in the city. Nora listened without interrupting, her face calm, though her fingers gripped the fabric of her skirt tightly. She knew her duty to her family, but the cost felt heavier than anyone else could understand. The arrangement was made with the Lancaster family, who controlled a massive portion of the city's banking and real estate. Nora was to marry Thomas Lancaster, the younger son of the family, a man known mostly for his love of nightlife and expensive habits. Thomas spent his days at the local racetracks and his nights drinking in underground clubs, entirely unbothered by the responsibilities of his family name. For Thomas, this marriage was simply a task his family forced upon him to make him look respectable to the public. For Nora, it felt like a sentence to a life of constant worry and loneliness. She did not care for his charm or his easy smile, knowing the reckless nature that lay right beneath the surface. Yet, the true difficulty of the situation was much deeper, because Nora had already given her heart to someone else entirely. The head of the Lancaster family was Raymond, the older brother who had taken over all operations after a sudden family tragedy years ago. Raymond Lancaster was a man who commanded immediate silence whenever he entered a room, possessing a reputation for being completely ruthless in business. He was a striking figure, with hair as white as winter snow and skin so pale it seemed to reflect the light around him. The public whispered about his health and his reclusive lifestyle, as he was rarely seen during the day and only attended essential evening meetings. Nora knew the rumors that surrounded him, whispers of a strange nature and a family line that stretched back much further than the city archives recorded. But she also knew a side of him that the rest of high society had never been permitted to see. 7 months before the wedding date, Nora had attended a crowded charity gala at the City Museum. Overwhelmed by the heat and the constant chatter of wealthy suitors, she had slipped away into the quiet historical archives in the back. She was standing near a shelf of old journals when Raymond entered the room, clearly seeking the same isolation she was. For a brief moment, the cold, untouchable businessman dropped his guard completely. They ended up talking for 20 minutes, a short conversation that changed everything for Nora. They spoke of the heavy weight of family expectations and the quiet desire to escape the roles they were forced to play. Nora saw a deep isolation in his pale eyes, and Raymond listened to her with a seriousness that no one else had ever shown her. That single meeting created an unspoken bond between them that grew stronger with every family gathering. When his hand accidentally touched hers while passing a glass, his skin felt as cold as ice, causing a strange shiver to run down her spine. Yet his gaze remained steady and warm, anchoring her in the middle of the crowded rooms. Despite this connection, Raymond was the person who had personally finalized the marriage contract between Nora and his younger brother. He did it out of a strict sense of duty to protect his family's future and to give Thomas some stability. Nora understood that his position required him to put his personal feelings aside, but it did not make the situation any easier to bear. As the weeks passed, the tension between Nora and Raymond became almost impossible to ignore. At formal dinners, they sat at opposite sides of the long table, their eyes meeting through the candlelight, while Thomas talked loudly about his latest purchases. Thomas noticed nothing, completely occupied with his own amusement and the fine wine he consumed in large quantities. Nora tried her best to accept her fate, spending her nights looking out her bedroom window at the dark city. She prayed for the strength to survive a marriage to a man who saw her as nothing more than a pretty prize. She knew she would live in the Lancaster mansion and see Raymond every single day, a reality that felt like a specific kind of torture. The morning of the wedding arrived bright, clear sunshine that seemed to mock Nora's dark mood. The ceremony was held at the Grand Cathedral in the center of the city, a place reserved for the most prominent families. The large building was filled with thousands of white flowers, creating a scent so strong it made Nora feel slightly dizzy. By 11 o'clock, every single wooden bench was filled with the most influential political and financial figures in the region. The city's mayor sat near the front, while wealthy women whispered behind their fans about the size of the dowry. The collective wealth gathered in the room was enough to influence the economy of the entire state, and everyone was waiting for the event to begin. In the small waiting room near the entrance, Nora stood perfectly still while the final adjustments were made to her dress. The heavy white silk gown was decorated with detailed lace and pearls, weighing down her small frame. Her hands were shaking so much that she had to press them against her sides to keep them steady. Her father walked back and forth across the stone floor, pulling his gold pocket watch out of his vest every few minutes. He remarked that it was 15 minutes past the hour, and that Thomas was being highly irresponsible by keeping everyone waiting. Nora looked at the heavy wooden doors, a small part of her mind secretly hoping that her fiancé would never show up. At 20 minutes past the hour, the side door of the waiting room opened quickly, but it was not Thomas who walked inside. Raymond Lancaster stepped through the doorway, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the room. His white hair was neatly combed, and he wore a dark formal suit that made his pale skin look even more stark. The usual calm expression on his face was replaced by a tight, serious look, and his hand gripped a crumpled piece of paper. The room went completely quiet as Nora's father stopped pacing, the bridesmaids lowering their voices instantly. Raymond did not look at anyone else. His intense gaze fixed immediately on Nora with an expression of quiet regret. Silas Jenkins stepped forward, his face turning red with sudden anger as he demanded to know where Thomas was. He pointed out that the minister and the guests were waiting, and that this delay was causing a public scene. Raymond stood his ground, his voice quiet but clear as it echoed off the high stone walls. He stated simply that Thomas was not coming to the cathedral today. Silas stumbled back slightly, asking if there had been a sudden accident, or if his son had fallen ill. Raymond extended his pale hand and passed the crumpled paper to Nora's father, telling him to read the message for himself. The letter explained that Thomas had left the city at dawn on a train heading to New York. He had taken his belongings and eloped with a well-known cabaret dancer he had been seeing secretly for months. A sharp gasp came from the bridesmaids as Silas read the words, his face losing all its color as he realized the consequences. In their high society world, a bride left at the altar was a permanent disgrace that could never be washed away. Nora would be ruined socially, talked about in whispers for the rest of her life as the woman who was abandoned. Her father's creditors would hear the news by sunset and take everything they owned, leaving them completely destitute. Silas dropped the paper to the floor, whispering that his family was completely destroyed by this action. He accused the Lancaster family of ruining his daughter's life and breaking a legal agreement. Nora felt the room spin slightly, the heavy scent of the flowers suddenly feeling hard to breathe. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the social collapse that was about to happen. Then, Raymond's voice cut through the panic, steady and loud enough to command attention. He walked closer to Nora, ignoring her father completely, until he was standing just a few inches away from her. Raymond looked down at her, the scent of fresh rain and cold air following him. He stated firmly that he would not allow Nora to be ruined by his brother's actions. He reminded Silas that the Lancaster family had signed a formal contract with the Jenkins family, and he intended to honor that agreement. Silas stared at him in total confusion, asking what he meant by those words. Raymond kept his eyes on Nora, his expression softening as he spoke directly to her. He explained that the legal documents required only a signature from the head of the house, and the guests were expecting a groom from his family. Nora's heart beat rapidly against her ribs as she looked into his pale eyes, searching for any sign of pity. She found no pity there, but instead saw a fierce, quiet dedication that made her breath catch. She whispered a question, asking if he was offering to take his brother's place at the altar. Raymond answered quietly, saying he was offering her his name, his protection, and his life. He promised that if she took his hand, no one in the church or the city would ever dare to speak a word against her. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly, as he added that he would only do this if she truly wanted it, as he had no desire to force her into another arrangement. The importance of the choice hung heavily in the quiet room. If she walked out now, her family would lose everything, and she would face constant public shame. If she took his hand, she would be married to the most powerful man in the city, the very man she had spent months trying to forget. Outside the room, the church organ began to play the opening music for the ceremony, signaling that the doors were opening. Her father looked at her with a desperate expression, begging her to make a decision. Raymond held out his right hand, his white glove perfectly steady, though Nora could see a slight tension in his posture. Nora looked at the open doors leading to the crowded cathedral, then looked back at Raymond. She did not see a temporary solution. She saw the man she truly cared for. Slowly and with purpose, she lifted her arm, the silk of her dress rustling in the quiet space. She placed her hand firmly into Raymond's cold palm, telling him that she was ready. His fingers closed tightly around hers, providing a steady support that comforted her immediately. They turned together toward the aisle, and as they stepped into the bright light of the church, a wave of surprised whispers passed through the hundreds of guests. The walk down the long aisle of the cathedral was the most intense walk of Nora's life. Raymond and Nora moved with slow, measured steps, their movements perfectly synchronized as they walked past the crowded benches. The silence in the large room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Nora's heavy train moving across the stone floor. The guests sat in total shock, their expressions frozen as they realized what was happening. The city's mayor leaned forward in his seat, his glasses sliding down his nose as he stared at the couple. The wealthy women who had been gossiping moments before now sat with their mouths open, their fans completely still. At the front of the church, the elderly minister stood behind the altar, his face showing complete confusion. As the couple stopped before him, the minister looked past Raymond's broad shoulders, searching the back of the church for Thomas. He leaned forward and whispered quietly, stating that there must be a serious mistake because Thomas was missing. Raymond responded in a clear, firm voice that carried to the back of the room. He informed the minister that Thomas was absent from his duties and that he was stepping in as the head of the family to fulfill the contract. He told the minister to begin the ceremony without any further delay. The minister blinked in surprise, looking over at Silas Jenkins, who was standing near the front row, looking both terrified and relieved. Seeing no objection from the bride's father, and feeling intimidated by Raymond's steady stare, the minister opened his large book. He began to read the traditional words of the service, his voice shaking slightly under the high ceilings. Nora barely heard the familiar phrases as her entire focus narrowed down to the warmth of Raymond's hand holding hers. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a completely new existence, supported only by the man beside her. When it came time to say the vows, the true reality of what they were doing settled over the congregation. Raymond spoke his promises clearly, without any hesitation or doubt in his voice. He stated his full name and promised to take Nora as his wife, to care for her in sickness and health, through good times and bad, until death separated them. He kept his eyes on her face the entire time, his intense gaze conveying a deep sincerity. Nora looked up at him, seeing past the cold mask he usually wore in public. In his eyes, she saw the same thoughtful man from their brief meeting in the museum archives. Nora took a deep breath and spoke her own vows, her voice growing stronger with every word she muttered. She poured all her hidden feelings into the traditional phrases, promising to support him and stay by his side through whatever the future brought. When she finished speaking, the minister paused, realizing that the original wedding ring had been taken by Thomas during his flight. Raymond did not hesitate for a second. He reached down to his left hand and removed his own heavy gold signet ring. The ring carried the ancient Lancaster crest and had been passed down through generations of his family for over 300 years. He took Nora's left hand and slid the heavy gold band onto her ring finger. The ring was much too large for her slender finger, but she immediately closed her hand into a loose fist to keep it secure against her palm. The weight of the metal felt solid and protective, like a piece of armor shielding her from the world. The minister quickly finished the final blessings, making a small gesture with his hand to conclude the service. They did not share a kiss, as high society rules required them to keep such displays private. Instead, Raymond offered his arm, and Nora placed her hand over his sleeve. They turned together to face the crowd of guests, just as the organ began to play a loud, triumphant song. They walked back down the aisle together, not as a disgraced bride and a temporary groom, but as husband and wife. The guests watched them pass in a state of stunned quiet, the whispers starting up again, only after the couple reached the main doors. Raymond guided her out of the church and down the steps to a waiting carriage, his movements quick and protective. The door closed behind them, shutting out the noise of the city and leaving them alone in the quiet interior. The ride toward the Lancaster estate on the edge of the city was filled with a heavy silence. The energy that had sustained Nora during the ceremony began to fade, leaving behind a deep sense of uncertainty. She was now married to the most powerful and mysterious man in the state, a man she had secretly loved for months. But she did not know if he had acted out of affection for her, or simply out of a strict need to protect his family's reputation. When the carriage finally stopped before the iron gates of his large stone house, the servants rushed to open the door. Raymond escorted her inside, dismissing the staff with a quick wave of his hand. They stood together in the grand entrance hall of the mansion, surrounded by tall stone columns and old portraits of Raymond's ancestors. The house was quiet and dimly lit, the thick curtains keeping out most of the afternoon sun. Raymond turned to face her, his expression returning to the distant, formal mask he wore in public. He told her that she was completely safe now, and that the ceremony would protect her from any gossip. He added that he understood she had not planned to marry him, and that his presence might feel like a heavy burden to her. He informed her that he had ordered the staff to prepare the large suite in the east wing for her personal use. Nora looked at him, feeling a sudden ache in her chest as she realized what he was thinking. He believed that she resented him for taking his brother's place, and that she viewed this marriage as a trap. Before she could find the words to explain her true feelings, Raymond raised his hand slightly to stop her from speaking. He told her that she did not need to thank him or pretend to be happy about the arrangement. He stated that she would have full access to his wealth and his total protection, and in return, he only asked her to manage the household affairs. He promised that he would never force himself into her life or demand anything from her that she did not wish to give. With a brief, formal bow, he wished her a good afternoon and turned away, walking down the long hallway toward his private study. The heavy wooden door closed firmly behind him, leaving Nora standing alone in her white wedding dress in the middle of the quiet hall. For the next 3 weeks, the new husband and wife lived according to a strict and distant routine. To the outside world, they appeared to be a perfectly united couple, attending necessary public events together. The local newspapers had published several articles about the sudden change at the wedding. But Raymond's immense financial influence quickly stopped the rumors from spreading further. Inside the large house, however, they lived like polite strangers who shared a roof. They ate their meals at opposite ends of a very long mahogany dining table, speaking only when necessary. Their conversations were limited to discussions about estate expenses, property maintenance, and upcoming charity events. Every evening after dinner, Nora would return to her rooms in the east wing, holding the heavy gold ring that she now wore on a chain around her neck. Raymond spent his nights locked away in his office, working under the light of a single lamp until the early hours of the morning to keep his distance. During those weeks, Nora began to notice the strange details of Raymond's daily existence that set him apart from other men. The windows in his private rooms were always covered with thick, dark velvet curtains that blocked out every ray of sunlight. The servants who worked in the house were incredibly quiet, moving through the halls like shadows, and speaking only in low whispers. Raymond himself never seemed to touch the food that was prepared for their formal dinners, merely moving it around his plate while he sipped a dark red liquid from a glass. His skin remained as pale as marble, and he never appeared tired, no matter how many nights he spent awake working. Nora also noticed that the temperature in his presence was always cool, as if he carried the winter air with him wherever he went. Despite these unusual things, she never felt afraid of him. Instead, she felt a deep curiosity and a growing desire to understand the secrets he kept hidden. She spent her days exploring the vast library in the center of the house, reading old texts and trying to find comfort in the quiet space. One evening in the middle of June, a violent storm hit the city, the wind howling through the trees outside and rain slamming against the windows. Was sitting in a large leather chair near the fireplace in the library, holding a book of poetry that she had found on one of the high shelves. Raymond was sitting across the room at his large desk, reviewing financial reports from his shipping companies. The only sounds in the room were the crackling of the logs in the fire and the steady noise of the storm outside. The quiet atmosphere was suddenly broken when the heavy double doors of the library were pushed open with great force, slamming against the wall. Standing in the doorway, soaked through with rain and looking completely disheveled, was Thomas Lancaster. He smelled strongly of cheap alcohol, his expensive clothes were ruined with mud, and his face was twisted into an expression of intense anger. Nora let out a small cry of surprise, dropping her book to the floor as she stood up from her chair. Raymond was on his feet instantly, moving with a speed that seemed almost impossible for a human being. In a fraction of a second, he had crossed the large room and placed himself directly between his younger brother and his wife. Raymond demanded to know the meaning of this intrusion, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone that filled the room. Thomas stumbled forward into the light of the fire, his hands shaking as he pointed an accusatory finger at his brother. He shouted that he had returned to claim what belonged to him, referring to Nora as his rightful bride. Raymond did not move an inch, his posture rigid as he reminded Thomas that he had abandoned her to run away to New York. Thomas let out a bitter, explaining that the cabaret dancer had stolen all his money and left him stranded as soon as she realized he did not have the family jewels. Thomas explained that he had spent the last 3 weeks living in poverty and begging for a train ticket back to the city. He added that he had read a discarded newspaper and discovered that his own brother had taken his place and married Nora. He accused Raymond of acting like a hero while secretly plotting to steal the woman he wanted for himself. Raymond's hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dark intensity that Nora had never seen before. He told Thomas that he had only stepped in to protect Nora from the public disgrace that Thomas had caused. Thomas turned his angry gaze toward Nora, asking her if she had planned the whole situation with Raymond from the very beginning. He accused her of choosing the older brother because he held the true power and fortune of the family name. Raymond moved forward with a sudden, protective anger, but Nora's clear voice stopped him before he could strike his brother. She stepped out from behind the desk, her head held high, and her eyes bright with determination. She told Thomas to stop insulting his brother by projecting his own selfish nature onto him. Nora stated firmly that Thomas was a coward who ran away from his responsibilities whenever things became difficult. She added that she would have preferred to face complete social ruin rather than spend a single day married to a man like him. Thomas opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out as he looked at her confident expression. Nora took another step forward, her focus shifting entirely away from Thomas and locking onto Raymond. Her voice became softer, but carried a deep seriousness that filled the quiet library. She told Raymond directly that she had not married him for his wealth, his prominent title, or his social protection. She confessed that she had married him because she chose him with her own free will, having cared for him since their meeting 7 months ago. She explained that when he offered his hand at the altar, it did not feel like a sacrifice to her, but like a true salvation. The silence that followed her words was complete, the only sound being the wind hitting the glass windows. Raymond stared at her in total disbelief, his usual cold composure breaking down completely under the weight of her words. He looked at her, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time in his life, his pale skin seeming to soften in the firelight. Thomas looked between the two of them, finally realizing that he was completely irrelevant to the connection they shared. Raymond told Thomas to leave the house immediately, his voice quiet but filled with an absolute authority that could not be challenged. He informed his brother that his lawyer would provide a small allowance for him to live in Europe. But if he ever returned, he would face legal action for his debts. Thomas knew he had lost completely. He turned around and walked out into the storm, the front door closing loudly behind him. The library became quiet once again, the fire casting long shadows across the floor. Raymond slowly walked across the distance between them, his breathing heavy, as he stopped just a few inches away from Nora. He asked her in a raw, quiet voice if she truly meant the words she had spoken, looking at her with an expression of vulnerability. Nora reached out and placed her hand against his pale cheek, telling him that she had never lied to him and that she loved him. Raymond closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into the warmth of her hand against his cold skin. The heavy tension that he had carried for years seemed to vanish entirely in that single moment of acceptance. He opened his eyes, their pale depths now filled with a deep, quiet affection that he no longer tried to hide. He reached out and brought her close to him, his arms strong and secure as they wrapped around her waist. He spoke her name softly, a sound that carried a promise of complete devotion for all the years to come. Nora rested her head against his chest, listening to the unusually slow, steady rhythm of his heart. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, knowing that the long weeks of pretense and distance were finally over. They stood together by the fireplace for a long time, watching the flames destroy the remaining papers on the desk. Raymond explained that he had spent his entire life believing he was meant to be alone, hidden in the shadows because of what he was. He told her that her presence had brought a light into his dark world that he never expected to find. He took her left hand, lifting it to look at the heavy gold signet ring that still rested securely on her finger. He remarked that the ring had found its true owner, someone who possessed the strength to wear the family name with dignity. Nora smiled up at him, telling him that she would never take it off, as it represented the choice she had made. They walked together out of the library, leaving the storm behind them as they moved up the grand staircase toward the main rooms of the house. There were no more separate wings or formal distances between them from that night forward. In the days that followed the confrontation, a noticeable change occurred within the walls of the Lancaster estate. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back during the late afternoon, allowing the soft amber light to fill the long hallways. The servants moved with a lighter step, sensing the new warmth that had taken hold of the household. Raymond still spent his days managing his vast business interests, but he always returned to Nora as soon as the sun began to set. They spent their evenings walking through the large gardens behind the house, talking about everything they had kept hidden during the months of silence. Nora learned more about the ancient history of his family and the responsibilities he carried as the leader of his people. He explained the balance he had to maintain to keep his true nature a secret from the human society that surrounded them. She listened with deep attention, her understanding growing with every story he shared about his long past. She realized that his cold nature was not a sign of a hard heart, but a shield he used to protect those around him. In return, she shared her own thoughts and dreams, finding in him a listener who valued every word she spoke. The high society of Boston eventually stopped talking about the scandal of their wedding day, accepting Nora as the true mistress of the Lancaster house. Those who saw them together at public events could see the deep respect and quiet affection that existed between them. Her father's financial debts were completely settled by Raymond, allowing Silas to live out his remaining years in comfort and peace. The danger of ruin that had once threatened to destroy Nora's family had been completely transformed into a source of lasting stability. Nora knew that her life was now bound to a man who was very different from anyone else, but she felt no regret. As the summer turned into a cool, crisp autumn, Nora spent her afternoons sitting on the stone terrace, watching the leaves change color. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the path her life had taken, even though it had begun with a sudden crisis. She knew that the future would bring its own challenges, given the unusual nature of her husband's life and the long years ahead of them. But as she looked toward the horizon, she felt completely ready to face whatever came next, supported by the steady love they shared. The months transitioned smoothly from the bright colors of autumn into the quiet, gray landscape of winter. Snow began to fall over the city, covering the brick streets and the stone roof of the Lancaster estate in a thick white blanket. Nora found herself standing by the large windows of the drawing room, watching the flakes drift down through the cold air. The house was warm, heated by several large fireplaces that crackled softly in the background. Raymond entered the room quietly, his footsteps making no sound on the thick rugs as he approached her from behind. He placed a heavy woolen shawl over her shoulders, his cold fingers brushing against her neck for a brief second. Nora turned her head and smiled at him, leaning back against his chest as his arms came around her to hold her close. They watched the winter storm together in a comfortable silence that required no words to fill the space. Raymond noted that the city looked peaceful under the snow, a rare moment of quiet in a place that was usually filled with noise and movement. Nora agreed, feeling a deep sense of contentment in the safety of his embrace. Their life together had settled into a beautiful, quiet rhythm that felt completely natural to both of them. They spent their mornings reading together by the fire, sharing thoughts on various books and historical texts that they discovered in the library. In the afternoons, Nora took charge of the household affairs, organizing the estate and ensuring that the staff were well cared for. Raymond continued to handle his business ventures during the evening hours, but his focus had shifted from purely financial gain to creating a secure environment for his wife. He no longer seemed like the distant, untouchable figure that the public feared. To Nora, he was a gentle and protective partner. The contrast between Raymond's cold, physical nature and the warmth of his affection was something Nora grew to cherish deeply. His skin was always cool to the touch, a constant reminder of the secret world he belonged to. But his actions were filled with a genuine kindness. He took care to ensure that she never felt isolated or overwhelmed by the unusual aspects of their life. He introduced her to the small, trusted circle of individuals who knew his true identity. People who welcomed Nora with deep respect and warmth. She realized that she had not just joined a family, but had become part of a long and meaningful history. One evening, they hosted a small dinner for a few close friends, the first time they had opened the house to guests since their wedding. The dining room was beautifully decorated with winter greenery and candles, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. Nora managed the evening with a quiet confidence, moving among the guests with the grace of a woman who was completely secure in her position. Raymond watched her from his place at the head of the table, his pale eyes reflecting a deep pride in the woman she had become. The guests remarked on the evident happiness that existed between the host and hostess, the old rumors of a forced marriage completely forgotten. After the guests had departed, Raymond and Nora sat together in the quiet drawing room, watching the last embers of the fire burn down. Raymond took her hand, his fingers tracing the shape of the large gold ring that remained on her finger. He told her that he had lived through many winters in his lifetime, but this was the first one that had felt truly warm to him. Nora looked up at him, her heart full, as she told him that she felt exactly the same way. They knew that their connection was something rare, a bond that had been forged in the middle of a public scandal, but had grown into something enduring. As the night grew later, they walked together down the dark hallway toward their rooms, the quiet of the house surrounding them like a protective shield. Nora felt a deep sense of certainty about the life they were building, knowing that they had overcome the difficulties of their beginning. She knew that the world outside would always have its opinions and its whispers, but inside the walls of their home, those things had no power. They had found a true partnership, built on a foundation of mutual respect and a deep, unspoken understanding that would carry them through the years ahead. The winter slowly gave way to the early signs of spring, the snow melting from the garden paths to reveal the dark earth beneath. Small green shoots began to appear through the cold ground, a promise of the warmer days that were soon to follow. Nora spent more of her time outdoors, walking through the grounds and planning the restoration of the old greenhouses that had been neglected for years. Raymond often joined her during the twilight hours, offering his advice on the structural repairs and watching her work with a quiet amusement. He enjoyed seeing the life she brought to the old estate, turning a place that had once been a dark fortress into a vibrant and welcoming home. The project gave Nora a sense of purpose and a way to connect with the history of the land that surrounded them. She worked alongside the gardeners, choosing flowers and shrubs that would bring color and fragrance to the stone terraces during the summer months. Raymond supported her efforts completely, providing the resources needed to restore the entire property to its former beauty. Their relationship continued to deepen as they shared these simple, everyday tasks, finding a shared joy in the renewal of their surroundings. They learned to navigate the differences in their natures with a gentle patience, finding ways to bridge the gap between his world and hers. Nora accepted the limitations that his condition imposed, adjusting her routine to ensure they could spend the maximum amount of time together during the evening hours. Raymond, in turn, made an effort to be present in her world, attending occasional day events when the weather was overcast and cool enough for his comfort. One afternoon, Silas Jenkins came to visit his daughter at the estate, looking healthier and happier than he had in many years. He walked through the restored gardens with Nora, expressing his deep gratitude for the way things had turned out for their family. He admitted that he had been terrified on the day of the wedding, believing that his actions had brought total ruin upon his daughter's head. Nora assured him that she held no resentment, explaining that the event had turned out to be the greatest blessing of her life. Silas looked over at Raymond, who was standing near the edge of the terrace, and noted that he had never seen a man look more dedicated to his wife. The visit provided a sense of closure for Nora, allowing her to put the anxieties of her past completely behind her. She felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her family was secure, and that her father could live out his days without the burden of financial ruin. After Silas left, she walked up to Raymond, who was watching the sunset from the stone steps. She slipped her hand into his, feeling the familiar, comforting coolness of his skin, as they watched the light fade from the sky. Raymond spoke softly, remarking that the house felt full of life now, a complete contrast to the quiet museum it had been for the past century. He thanked her for bringing her warmth into his existence, a sentiment that made Nora's eyes fill with tears of happiness. She told him that she had simply found the place where she belonged, beside a man who valued her for exactly who she was. They stood together until the first stars appeared in the dark sky, a clear and beautiful view that seemed to stretch out forever before them. The transition from the old life to the new had been sudden and filled with dramatic changes, but the result was a deep and lasting peace. Nora knew that they had built something special, a relationship that could withstand the scrutiny of the world and the passage of time. As they walked back inside the warm house, she felt a quiet confidence in the strength of their bond. They had turned a potential disaster into a beautiful reality, proving that some choices, though difficult at the moment, lead to the exact future we were meant to find. The years would pass over the city like water over stone, changing the names on the streets and the shapes of the buildings, but the walls of the Lancaster estate would remain unchanged. Nora sat on the stone terrace during a quiet evening in late summer, looking out over the garden that she had spent so much time restoring. The flowers were in full bloom, filling the night air with a sweet, rich scent that reminded her of the journey she had taken to reach this place. She looked down at her hand, where the heavy gold signet ring still rested securely on her finger, its metal smooth from the passage of time. Raymond stepped out from the shadow of the doorway, moving with the same silent grace that had always defined him. His white hair caught the pale light of the moon, and his skin looked as clear and untouched as it had on the day they first stood together at the altar. He sat down in the chair beside her, his cool hand covering hers in a familiar gesture that brought an immediate sense of comfort to her heart. They did not need to speak to understand each other's thoughts. The long years of shared experiences had created a quiet communication that existed beneath their words. Nora thought about the path that had brought them together, a road that had begun with fear, debt, and the sudden betrayal of a reckless younger brother. She realized that the initial scandal which had threatened to destroy her life had actually been the very event that saved her from an empty existence. If Thomas had not fled the city, she would have been bound to a man she could never respect, living a life of constant pretense in high society. Instead, she had been given a name that carried true meaning, a protection that never failed, and a love that grew stronger with every passing season. She looked toward the future with a calm and steady heart, knowing that her path would be different from that of the women she had grown up with in the city. Her life was tied to a man who existed outside the normal boundaries of time, a reality that would bring its own unique challenges as the years moved forward. Yet she felt no fear or uncertainty about the road ahead, because she knew that the foundation they had built was completely solid. They had created a sanctuary within the walls of their home, a place where their true selves could exist without the need for masks or public explanations. The choice she had made to place her hand in his at the cathedral had been a choice for absolute salvation, a decision that had rewritten the story of her life in the best possible way. As she watched the stars appear in the dark sky above the garden, Nora felt a deep sense of gratitude for every step of the journey they had shared. The greatest stories do not always begin with perfect circumstances. Sometimes they are born out of the middle of a sudden crisis, finding their true direction only when the old expectations are completely cleared away. She turned her eyes to her husband, meeting his steady gaze with a smile that carried all the devotion of her heart, entirely at peace with the timeless future that waited for them both in the quiet shadows of their shared world.